if you have a beard, certainly you're going to be confused with Hemingway. I've been down to Key West on Hemingway days. They have this holiday down at Key West every year in January. And they have a Hemingway look-alike contest, if you can believe it. So the town is full of men who look like me. If the subject is serious enough and mysterious enough, then it's to interest me and to engage me, and all my energy and all my intellect and all my honesty, whatever I can muster, then it's bound to be a subject that's too mysterious and too difficult for me to provide answers for. I mean, I think it's enough for any novelist, any artist for that matter, to provide us with the serious and important questions regarding what it is to be human, for instance, and that it's asking either too much or too little of an artist to provide the answers as well. You know, it's not that kind of an activity, that way of thinking, really. We can ask historians to provide answers, or journalists to provide answers, psychologists, philosophers, maybe. But I don't think we can ask artists to provide our answers. We want, in a funny way, we want more than answers from our artists, I think, in a paradoxical way almost. And we want them to oblige us to ask ourselves the questions we didn't know were there in the first place. You know? And I think this novel attempts to do that. It attempts to force us to ask questions about sexual criminality, ask questions about the internet, ask questions about pornography, ask questions about obesity, secrecy, betrayal, identity, the truth in the end, finally, epistemological questions, philosophical questions. Providing answers, though, is not, it's beyond me in a way, and also, I won't say beneath me, but it's outside the enterprise. The gradual utilization of children as consumers in the consumer economy, and the gradual creation of children as the single largest consumer group in our society. We sell more goods to children annually than we do to adults, and they're a bigger segment than any other age group, segment of society. Children are of the capitalist consumer economy, and increasingly so around the world, not just in the United States. And it's a process that really began in small increments, slowly, and then at an accelerated rate. But it began in the 1950s, when basically when we invited the salesman into the home in the form of the television set. We, I think, began by believing with television that the advertising existed to make the programs possible. But quickly it became the opposite. The programs exist to make the advertising possible, just as in the case now with the internet. And up to this point, you know, in a very real way, we protected children from advertising, from consumerism, because they're too vulnerable, they're too easily fooled, they're too easily seduced by advertising. And so we had all those jokes about keeping the salesman outside the house, you know, slamming the door on the salesman. The salesman comes in over the top of the door, you close the window and lock them so the salesman stays out. But when you bring in a television set, and then you have an economy where both parents have to work, then you start using the television as a babysitter. And then you put a television set in the kid's bedroom. And pretty soon the kid is watching hours and hours a day of advertising. And then you reach a point in our time now, I mean, that's gradual over 30, 40 years, a half century. But now we've got to a point where, every kid is walking around with his own screen or her own screen 24 hours a day, every waking hour anyhow, either watching it on an iPad, a computer, or a phone, and being constantly bombarded by advertisements for one thing or the other, but in order to basically turn the kid into a consumer. And so this is we've got to think about what's the implications of that process. It isn't simple and it isn't obvious, but the implications are huge, I think. And the main one, so almost metaphysical, is that you've objectified the child, and you therefore feel free to manipulate the child. The same way we've objectified the people that we colonized, or the people that we've used for economic purposes in any way, slaves, for instance. We objectify them once we do it so that we don't feel bad about it, basically, so we don't feel guilty. And you objectify the workers, if you're abusing and using and turning them into utilities. And you objectify children when you turn them into consumers. And once you objectify a child, objectify anybody, any human being, you're free to use them as a sexual object too. And there is a linkage between that. And it's to the degree that we in the process of objectifying, sexualize the child, because we know sex sells. You can sell goods through sex faster than through any other means. You glamorize it with sex. And once we've sexualized the child, it's really easy then to cross lines over into abusing the person, the child in this case, sexually. We've done it in racial terms. Men do it to women. It's always the best way to abuse, the quickest way to end up abusing a woman is to objectify her to start with. There is a role there in the community, in the community of man, if you will, that the storyteller, the way I like to talk about it and think about it is what's the role of the storyteller in the community, in the tribe, the large human tribe. What's the role of the storyteller, since that's what I aspire to be? And you ask yourself that. And again, I'll go back to fundamentals in a way, and the way I was speaking a minute ago about what is a story and what is art in that sense. There is a fundamental role that from the beginning of time, human time anyhow, that the storyteller has held. And that is really to tell his or her fellows simply what it is to be human. We don't know. We're the only species that doesn't know what it is to be itself. I mean, every other species doesn't worry about it. It doesn't have to worry about it. But human beings have to worry. What is it to be human? The best and the worst of it. The demons and the angel. We need to know in order to control our own fate, our own destiny. And we need to know it over and over and over again with each new generation. We have to retell what it is to be human. And we do it best through stories, I believe. That the stories that matter to us and continue to matter to us and that we tell again and again and again are in a sense at bottom the same stories, but we retell them and reclothe them in our own time, in our own context, with each generation. So this is, yes, a 21st century story. The internet is part of it. It may be Homeric on one level, but it's clothed in the 21st century. And Huckleberry Finn was clothed in the 19th century. And it has an ancient structure to it, and it has a direct vernacular spoken voice behind it that's easily accessible. and this tries to accomplish some of the same things in that regard. But its essential function is just simply telling, well, what it is to be human, it is to be the kid, or it is to be the professor. That's human. And we would rather not know that, perhaps, about ourselves as human beings. We'd rather not think of ourselves as addicted or as lost, perhaps, in some ways, as the kid is, at least at the beginning of the story. And as lost as the professor is in his own way. Both of them, in their own ways, haven't lost any memory of skin. The professor's case, because of his gluttony, his obesity, his addiction to food, and then in the kid's case, because of his addiction to the internet and to pornography and the loss of his body and the digitalized version of his body. So that's very 21st century, but it's also a very old story.
Mediapart.
There is a genre that the novels seem to borrow from, and then leap out of and try to transcend. The Bildungsroman is certainly lies behind this, and the genre really, the novel that lies behind this, just as Huckleberry Finn lies behind Rule of the Bone. The novel that lies behind this is most immediately is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which is a boys' book. We think of it as a boys' book. Actually, I went back and reread it and realized it's a much more sophisticated book than that. It's really an interesting and beautifully written book. But it has an archetypal structure and setup with the terms of the characters, particularly there's a boy who's not quite a child and not quite an adult, who's crossing over into adulthood, and then there's an older man who's both protective and custodial and a mentor on the one hand, but also ominous and threatening on the other, and is physically grotesque in some way. I mean, Long John Silver is to Jim Hawkins in some of the ways as the professor is to the kid. But then you realize, I did after I reread it, I said, well, you know, this is an archetypal arrangement. This is as old as storytelling. This goes back to Homer. This is Telemachus and Odysseus. This is an ancient story. This is also James Joyce's Ulysses. This is Stephen Dedalus and Bloom. So this is old, and so there's no reason for me not to try to tap into that and then expand my reach from there. And you know, I also have a functional belief in working out of popular or folk motifs and modes, or genres, if you want, and trying. I mean, just as all, in a way, I think all great music does. Think of some of the great American jazz music, for instance. It starts, you know, in spiritual music and blues and field hollers and folk music, and then along the one, you know, like Duke Ellington, you know, who takes these very rudimentary kinds of chord changes and arrangements and song patterns and so forth, and it orchestrates them into something else, something larger. You could still hear it, you know, but you could still hear that the blues behind it, you know, you could still hear those African-American slave chants. You could still hear the African-American spirituals behind it. And I think all great art does that. I mean, all great painting does that, you know. It starts with the caves of Lascaux and then ends up in Picasso, you know, or postmodern even, and so on. If it doesn't have those roots, it doesn't really connect. It's merely conceptual, I think. And this is true for literature, it's true for music, it's true for art, true for dance, I mean, in theater. They all begin in very fundamental relations with the people, with the folk, with the community. Yeah. I think this book is more ambitious than The Reserve in formal and aesthetic terms. In terms of its reach, it tries to do more. There's no question of that, and I would say that it ranks in those terms, so the terms of its ambition, let's say, literary ambition, with Continental Drift, La Drift de Continent, and Cloud Splitter. Was it Bouffon de Neige, I think, in the French translation, which reach for a kind of almost mythical range while still being rooted in realism. And it tries to walk that line and reach that dimension, literary dimension, I think. In terms of like personal difficulty or personal relevance, let's say, put it that way, autobiographical relevance, then I would say that there are other books that in some ways matter more and differently, like Affliction, which deals with alcoholism and violence and domestic family violence and so forth, male violence. And this mattered a lot to me on a personal level. Or in the case of the Sweet Hereafter in De Beau Lointain, that mattered to me on a personal level, the death of a child and the effect on a family or on parents and so forth. My home family endured endured the loss of a child, and so it was up close to me in that sense. And so that, books have different functions in your life and different ambitions. Sometimes they're personal issues that you're trying to work through and understand and come to some deeper resolution with, and other times they may have that aspect, but you're also reaching for something on a larger historical or literary ambition. For me, the character brings with him or her the story and the ideas. It isn't the ideas or the story bring the character. So I always start with the character, and the kid's character. I mean, I was aware of there being a colony of convicted sex offenders living under this bridge that I could see from my apartment in Miami. Anyone who lived in Miami was aware of it. Read the newspaper, you knew about it. But I think I was the only one writing a novel about it at the time. Maybe there's others now. But the novel wasn't about the causeway and the colony of men. The novel is about the kid. And I imagined a kid caught down there, and the kid. So the character appeared to me first, and then I said, well, this can't be just about the kid, because for a number of reasons. One is that his world is so small and constricted, and he's so limited in his understanding of his world. And in order to broaden the context, I'm going to have to bring in another character from a different context, from a bigger world, and who has a better education and awareness, historical and social awareness of what's going on here. And so the professor kind of stumbles into the scene. I mean, it's fairly early in the book, and it's right after the police raid the settlement and break it up, and then the professor appears out of the darkness, and while the kid is reading the Bible, he's thinking whoa, it's God. And no, it's not. It's just, but then I didn't know where I was going in that sense. Like, I knew I needed the character like that, and I thought, well, an academic, a sociologist, someone who's curious about this commingling of sexual offenders and homeless people, and who better than a academic sociologist? And then when he appears, because the kid was reading the Bible and kind of expecting God, or at least a biblical personality to show up, I just let him expand in size and in beard and in presence and so forth, and to kind of fill out the dramatic needs of the moment. And so the character began to form at that point of the professor, and I got interested in him and who could he possibly be, and I've known people like him in the past. I taught at universities for many years, and so I've known academics, I've known morbidly obese people, I've known people who were bona fide geniuses. And so you can combine all these different factors. I've known people who had secrets in their lives, compartmentalized lives, people who were spies, people who were sexual predators who had sexual secrets. And so I could combine these different things together. I want a writer, I want a character, it didn't have to be a writer, but I want a character to replace the professor. He appears after the professor leaves for some of the same reasons that I wanted the professor initially that I mentioned. And I thought, well, it would be amusing and interesting, and I could raise the level sort of philosophically in this story if I bring in a writer who raises some of the questions that the novel is just, up to now, not quite gotten into, the epistemological questions, the philosophical questions, and also at the same time I could play with the kind of metafictional aspects of the novel as well, and bring that forward without making a big deal out of it and without making it too self-conscious. And because I'm interested in the possibilities of fiction in that regard, commenting on its own process, in a sense, and its own artificiality, and while revealing it at the same time. And so he appears there, and it's true. I mean, he's much more cynical than I am, and he's much more. He's cheating on his employer, after all, and I don't do that. He's traveling on expense account down there and pretending to do research when he's really just, having a good time. And he's sort of predatory when it comes to librarian widows, and makes the moves on the professor's widow. But he really also allows the novel to raise serious philosophical questions about truth and how do we know it, and in a way that I felt comfortable with. I don't like to read, and I don't like to write what we call, philosophical novels. I think novels are not great at delivering philosophy, and philosophy is not great at delivering story. But I did want this novel to push the envelope a little bit there, and he was a way for me to do that, because he's a good foil for the kid. And then we've reached a point in the novel where we really need to test the kid and see how far he's come over the course of, 400 pages or so. And we need to test ourselves and see how far we've come, too. And that's sort of how he works in my mind toward the end there in the novel. Mediapart. I'm not a futurist, the way some writers are, but I'm very sensitive to the shifts that are happening in our world that are due to this technology and its pervasiveness. The French version of the title uses Lointain, which is distant memory. And the English version, the American version of it, of course, is lost memory. And the difference is really important to me. I mean, we had a problem with the title, my French translator and publisher and myself, because we didn't like, and I didn't like either, Purdue in the title with the word peau. It just it didn't work together. Lost memory of skin, it works pretty well in English, but lost memory of skin in French didn't work anywhere near as well. It didn't sound good, and so Lointain sounded better. But it's softer. It's not as dark. If you have a lost memory, that means you have no memory whatsoever. You don't even know you once had it, a body or a skin. If it's a distant memory, then you have some vague recollection of having had a body. Maybe you don't have one now, but you say, once I had a body. But what if you go through a couple of generations and there's no longer any memory of intimacy actually being achieved through physical contact, or any reality to your actual body? And that's what I'm trying to point to, that we're in danger of losing even the memory of having had a body, of having had sensual contact with one another. And this is, the implications to me of this are vast. I mean, as a species, we rely incredibly on touch, on touching each other. I mean, we humanize each other. There's lots been written by anthropologists and by biologists and students of animal behavior regarding grooming, for instance, and the history of grooming and its civilizing aspects, how it has calmed and civilized otherwise wild, violent species like, chimpanzees and other higher primates like human beings. And when you lay a hand on the shoulder of a fellow human being, you aren't just communicating something, you're also establishing a kind of humanizing bond between yourself and that other human being. When you make love to another human being with your body, you're doing the same thing. When you hold a child in your arms, or an old person, you're going through a kind of humanizing process that calms and soothes the other person and the person herself as well. Okay, if we reach the point where we have lost the memory of that, and that our only mode of communicating with another human being is on a screen, then we've lost something that's absolutely essential to what it means to be human. And I think that's what the title is sort of pointing toward, the danger of that. And I don't think we should or could, or it would make the slightest bit of difference if you suddenly made the internet illegal or tried to control it in any way. It's here to stay, and but it's radically altering our lives, and it's the degree to which it's a powerful tool is the degree to which it's a dangerous tool as well. The more transparent you are, then in a way, the more secrets you need in order to maintain privacy. Soon, the only way you can have any privacy is through secrecy. You go underground, in a sense, And in any kind of total surveillance society, I mean, whether it's the old Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or, North Korea today, any kind of totally surveillance society like that, the more necessary it is for people to go underground into secrecy in order to have any privacy whatsoever. I mean, we're in such danger of losing our privacy in the United States, not just because of the worldwide media hookup, and not because of Facebook, but that too, of course. But and we're doing that to ourselves. But also since 9/11, particularly, America has become increasingly a surveilled society, I should put it that way. And for instance, when I was young in the 1950s, I was born in 1940, so the 40s and 50s, and all the way up really until 2001, I could pretty much disappear in America, without too much trouble. You could come and go even, I could go into Canada, come back, and nobody quite knew it. I could drive across it. I didn't have to go through the border patrol points and all. There wasn't enough. They couldn't keep track of Americans. Nobody really tried to keep track of Americans. It's too big a country, too much open space, too easy to get lost there. I mean, that's been one of our overriding myths in a way, is we love this fact that you could get in I mean, look at on the road, you know, you get in a car, you drive west, nobody knows you're there, you know, you disappear and reinvent yourself in a new place. That's a great American story. You can't do that anymore. You know, you really can't disappear anymore. Your credit card will track you, your telephone will track you, your car will be tracked. When I was 16 years old, I was just telling the story to somebody, you know, in 1956, I stole a car with another kid. We ran away. We were runaways. And in eastern Massachusetts, on the East Coast. And we took off. And we were gone for 2 months. The cops couldn't find us. We were two kids in a stolen car. Nice new Oldsmobile we'd stolen. And we were gone. And we had jobs. You know, we got to Amarillo, Texas. We worked in a burger joint, flipping burgers in the night shift, and then living at a YMCA. And then we went on to, ended up in Pasadena, California, which is where Route 66 ends. And we went as far as that. And finally, we were caught. But the reason we were caught is because the guy who was with me, my partner in crime, confessed to a priest, and the priest turned us in to the police. And so we had to go back and, you know, and everything. But anyhow, the long story. But the point is, that couldn't happen today. We would get stopped at the first toll booth because we would be photographed. We would be videotaped, and our number plate would show up of the stolen car, and they would have the car nailed right there. You know, that kind of difference, I mean, in society, in one lifetime, is enormous. And yet we've done it without even being aware of it. It's kind of amazing to me. Here I am in France, you know, thousands of miles from my home, and I'm totally plugged in. You know, my assistant is in upstate New York, answering my emails and phone calls for me because everything is connected to my home in Miami. 1,500 miles away from where my assistant is. Most of the professional world that I work with thinks I'm in upstate New York because they're directing their phone calls and their emails to her and my office up there. I might as well be in Florida as far as, you know, my bill collectors are concerned and financial life, because that's the address that I'm using on my credit cards and so forth. But here I am in France, and I'm just corresponding back and forth and keeping track of all this stuff. I'm networked in. I haven't disappeared. I should have disappeared. I mean, you know, normally in the past I would come to France and I'd be out of touch for 2 weeks or however long I was here, and nobody would be able to reach me. And you know, phone calls are too expensive and elaborate, and if I didn't want to answer the phone, I didn't have to, and I could disappear. It's impossible now. The professor's right, and I think I'm right in saying that. The alternative to total surveillance, and that is, after all, what we're talking about here, is secrecy. And it's the only inevitable response. It's the only way we can preserve privacy. And so there are, those steps in between of partial privacy and partial exposure or transparency, which is really where we kind of like to have exercised a kind of existential control over our relations to the larger world, is in those steps. Some people I'm somewhat exposed, to others I'm not. I reveal some information to my bank and some I withhold, etc. Those are important steps because they give us a kind of existential control over how we exist, all the many dimensions in which we exist, with which we exist socially, and those you put it very nicely. The gradations, the shadings between light and dark are disappearing very rapidly, it's interesting, really interesting to me that shift that's going on. We're right in the middle. I'm so glad I lived this long, you know, that I could live through it and see it happening, because it is, to me, a revolutionary time. not in a classic Marxist sense, but in terms of the transition, an anthropological sense. There's an anthropologically deep transition going on right in front of our eyes, happening so rapidly that people my age can have lived on both sides of it. That is an existential test, and that's all that's all any of us really have. In the end, is what we have to choose to believe. We can't be like Lointain and suspend judgment and hang in the air like that. That kind of detachment is not available to us without, in a sense, removing us from life. And so the kid has to choose. But so does the reader. It puts the reader in the same position as the kid. That was what I was trying to do at that point in the book, without making a big deal out of it and without making a kind of cute game out of it, a kind of metafictional game. I was really trying to say, okay, I've put myself as an author and I've put the reader in the same position as the kid regarding the professor's fate. And so we have to choose what to believe. And it's, yes, I suppose it's on a level of fable, it's operational, but also I think just as on the level of the story, it's important too. And I haven't thought about it in terms of the language we've been using here in the last few minutes with regard to transparency and secrecy and so forth, but it does apply, I suppose. But, you know, that's always been the case in all human interaction, even in the most intimate relations. Someone, your spouse or your child or your parents, you never truly know. You have to choose what to believe about the person on a certain level. You can know a lot, but you can't know everything. And I mean, it's kind of a truism. We always say it about a marriage. Oh, you can never really know what goes on in a marriage. You know, they say, "Oh, I'm so surprised they got divorced." You know, I thought they were so happy. And they say, "Well, you never really know what's going on in a marriage." You know, all those little things we say to explain the fact that no matter how well we knew them, we didn't really know them at bottom on a certain level. Well, I think that's always been the case. It's true about human knowledge. It's sort of an epistemological truth. In a way, you can't know it all. You have to, at a certain point, make a leap of faith or belief in that way. So I think that's what the book is sort of leading toward, and taking the kid toward. You know,